the appeal. I don't propose this to be hugely long and detailed. I think a lot of it hopefully will be in the questions that you ask. So please feel free as soon as you have inspiration to start firing over a question, and Rum will have them in line ready to grill me with at the end. As she's controlling the slides, can I say, Rum, please, can we have the first slide? Thank you very much. Obviously, CAP and BCAP regulating advertising in the UK across broadcast, online media and any other media where advertising exists, have had rules in place for quite a significant period of time on gambling advertising. I don't propose to go into huge amounts of detail. Gambling is obviously a legally controlled or a product range subject to significant legal controls, including product licensing. So it's therefore appropriate that there are specific and dedicated rules in sections of the UK advertising codes which are designed to ensure that the harms and the risks associated with that type of advertising, the use of those kinds of products, as they may be reflected in advertising, are appropriately mitigated. General who, for example, experience issue. What we do is to who choosing to protect using our rules under 18s who are obviously not of legal age to gamble and should therefore not be addressed or engaged with marketing for gambling and lotteries products. We carried out a consultation which closed in the past couple of months, looking at whether we needed to beef up the level of restriction on the appeal of ad content to under 18s. This is pretty crucial in the sense that gambling products are legally available. It's perfectly reasonable for them to be marketed, but obviously we need to strike an appropriate and proportionate balance. And one of the ways our rules do this in relation to under 18s is basically to remove content which will draw attention from those who are not old enough to gamble, who might be within an audience, effectively hooks that sort of draw them in to engage with the commercial messages. Remove those from the equation so that it's perfectly reasonable for you as gambling advertisers to speak to adults within an audience, i.e. the people who are of legal age to participate in your products, etc., if they are so interested in your offering. However, it means we can protect those small numbers of children under 18s who are within audiences. And obviously I should say as well that there are, and I won't go into them, but there are obviously restrictions on where you can place ads, so not in children's media and not where children are disproportionately represented in an audience. So what we did was extend the scope of our restriction on the appeal of content. We've moved from particular to strong appeal. The existing rule says particular. The new rule will have various bits of detail in it, but it will basically, the big move is from the word particular to strong appeal. Now those terms might not sound like a very big change. In fact, it's fewer letters and particular strong. But basically what we've done is we've extended the scope from things which are for kids, which content which sort of relates to children's lives, etc. We've expanded that to restrict the use of more content relating to sports. In particular, we're going to be touching on over 25s. Under 25s under the existing rules are banned, but there are going to be more over 25s who are restricted. And then the other main sort of hotspot is around video games. I should say I'm using the term gambling as a sort of a shorthand, but this will apply to both gambling and lotteries, and it will apply across both the CAP code for non-broadcast and the BCAP code for broadcast advertising. So it's pretty comprehensive. I should also say that we are, and hopefully this session will point you toward it, we're conscious of the change here, we're conscious of the need to talk to industry and help you to come up to speed with where you need to be from the 1st of October. So we produce some quite detailed and extensive guidance to assist in the transition. Ron, could we have the next slide? Thank you very much. So this slide attempts to basically just expand on what I was saying there about the base definition, the concept of what we've done. Effectively, the particular appeal, the existing test within the rules, Particular appeal is a relative test. Basically, does something pound for pound appeal more to under 18s than it does to other audiences, all adults or different segments of what you could consider adult? If that's the case, at present, that kind of content, which the ASA considers to be of particular appeal, would be restricted. So for all intents and purposes, you're talking about things which sort of exist in kids' worlds. So they watch cartoons, they read read comics, etc., and they engage with fairy tales. They watch kids' movies. These are things for children in styles that are very child-centric, etc. And that's what's prohibited at the moment. What we've done in terms of the shift from particular to strong is extend that, and in doing that, the mechanism for this, the boring sort of technicalities of the regulation, it's very simple that we have removed the relativity of this, and we are simply saying that anything which has a significant level of appeal to under 18s, anything that is likely to draw their attention in terms of aspiration or numerically in terms of how popular it is, that content related to those subjects is now restricted. So one of the interesting examples of this is football, which I'm sure is probably at the front of most sports betting operators' minds. At present, football, references to football and so forth are perfectly fine, provided compliance is achieved with the existing rules. Obviously, football is incredibly popular. So the ASA would look at it under the particular appeal test, and what they would see is something that's just popular across all ages. So therefore, it doesn't trip the sort of the balance, as it were. It doesn't appeal more in terms of its audience slanted skew towards under 18. So at present, that would be okay. Under the strong appeal test, the balance is gone. It simply does this of itself, this activity, this type of content, these characters, individuals, personalities, etc. Do they have that level of appeal which we could consider to be strong? And with football as an activity, most kids play it on a very regular basis. They interact with it across all manner of media, and they are fans of it. They engage in it. They play in it. In the playground, they play for teams. It is hugely important in the childhood of many children. So, in which case, under the new restrictions, for content relating to football is going to be restricted quite significantly. In order to satisfy the new restrictions, and we'll have a slide later on just with a bit more detail around some suggestions for the steps that you need to take. Marketers are basically going to have to break down their ads from, we're not just talking about the things at the in front and center in the foreground, but the whole thing, the look and the feel, etc. To satisfy the ASA, there is nothing in there that sets off the alarm bells in terms of the likelihood of appeal. And obviously, as the UK advertising codes are a reverse burden at base, then it is for you to demonstrate to the ASA that you have complied. Can we have the next slide, please, Roman? So some further examples from the football one in practice, and this is roughly where the changes are. You've got to remember that we're extending the scope of the restriction. So all of the things that were of particular appeal are, by definition, in terms of this broader concept, they're subsumed into the stronger appeal concept. So they'll still all be restricted. But things around video games are another hotspot. Obviously, football, and we'll discuss a bit more about that in the examples in the forthcoming slides. Football's the sort of the key, I think, the key area, the key contention. But video games, I think, is another one. They are incredibly popular across age ranges on all manner of different levels. And effectively, what the ASA, I think, is going to be looking out for, in particular, are things like characters or gameplay depictions in ads. If an ad has a sort of a video gamey theme, etc., that's sailing very, very close to the wind immediately. And also things which sort of cross over. So if you have something which looks like a skin or a loot box, etc., common features in video games popular with kids, then you are, I think, in quite significant risk of being non-compliant. Another area to think about as well is going to be betting on things like esports. What the ASA is not banning any form of CGI or any form of graphical representation, for instance, of games. This is about video games which are popular, or styles from video games which are popular with under 18s. In terms of animation more generally, This is already an area which is pretty strongly covered. Obviously, cartoons are very child-centric in most sort of styles. Previously, the ASA has said that it's about representation. So it's possible, for example, to have a character like Santa Claus, but if you did a more adult-oriented or neutrally oriented representation, that type of representation sort of balances the nature of the cultural character. Everybody loves Santa Claus, but as long as it's not too child-oriented, that type of character will be okay. That balance is now gone. Those sort of classic cultural characters that are obviously strongly appealing to children, Christmas and Easter are very child-oriented. Those would now be caught in any form of depiction under the strong appeal rules. At the same time as well, certain cartoon styles are not oriented to manga, as an example. The ASA has found okay in the past. That's going to be a problem now. It's very cult, probably older teenagers, something that interests them. At the same time, youth-related content, obviously you can't depict under 25s, but the issue that we sometimes find is that people who are older, characters who are actors or whoever, brand ambassador, whatever, characters who are obviously older because of their date of birth are nevertheless depicted in a way which makes them seem younger. At the moment, under particular appeal, there's quite a broad tolerance in that regard. You'd have to do something very juvenile, very obvious to make the ASA consider that individual was behaving as a child trying to appeal, particularly to children in terms of their approach. Under strong appeal, I think there's a need for caution. If you're presenting someone who is older as someone younger in terms of their fashion, body art, jewelry, etc., and having them interact with music or dance that is related to younger viewers, younger audience, etc., there is a risk there. It doesn't mean to say that you can't have someone in the background who happens to be wearing sort of something, a cool jumper, or I don't know, a jumper's cool, I'm not entirely certain that that's a thing anymore, but the latest fashion kind of get-up. The less prominence, the less risk. But again, there is a clear need to avoid that type of sort of moment where someone who is 16, 17, looking at an ad sorry, I think I froze there. Could we get the next slide? Sorry. Okay. So in terms of compliance, and this just builds on what I was saying before in one of the earlier slides, there's a proactive requirement here. The S is going to expect you to have done due diligence on ads in terms of all of the content, not just a simple, oh, we don't think this ad appeals, just in terms of here's who we used, here's the styles we used, here's the themes that were involved, here's the graphics, we don't think that they appeal, and here's our reasoning, etc. The ASA, as part of the outcome of the CAP and BCAP process, committed to taking a strict line in enforcement. They are very keenly aware of the public contention, the controversy around all matters gambling, and obviously a lot of that falls on advertising. So I don't think that we're going to see a lot of sort of benefits of the doubt here. If the ASA is not convinced that an advertiser has taken all the reasonable diligence steps to ensure a piece of content that they are using is not of strong appeal, their default will be to uphold, because they're not satisfied under the reverse burden, which is inherent to the way the codes work, that the advertiser has done enough to show that they have complied with the code. I'll come to some of the more of the detail in a subsequent slide on personalities, but this sort of carrying out assessments box is just a suggested approach in a very general sense about how to tackle these questions. So first things first, is a piece of content from media, from a story, a narrative, a theme, something which is for under 18. So if you used a personality who was a children's TV presenter in the past 12 months, etc., you are in trouble from the very beginning. There's no real questions there. The ASA will immediately say, this person, this licensed character, this sort of theme, this cultural character, etc. They're related to children because of what they are, what their role is, a point in time. That's an immediate breach of the code. Where you have characters or where you have themes, etc., bits of content which do not sort of fall foul of the first hurdle, then what you need to start looking at is basically working out what their connections are in terms of the roles, what they do, where they're from, etc., and what the audiences are. We'll come to this in a bit more detail under the personality section, but effectively what the ASA is looking at here is this something that kids are inherently going to like because it's an aspirational thing, there is an affinity there, it's sort of something that speaks to them. In that case, there's a high degree of risk. At the same time, beyond that, there is the question of, where does this piece of content come from? And what metrics can be found to try to assess the level of audience? So that might be, well, I think audience data is a very good starting point, and obviously it's someone from television, cinema, video games, there are various metrics available, and also social media. And basically, the ASA will determine what the level of risk is, but in terms of social media, particularly in terms of social media, if you're talking a very significant either number or proportion of kids in the data that you have, and I appreciate that some of that data might be, for instance, only only sort of 13s up, because most social media is gated in that way. You're looking at risk. The ASA will look at these indications, and if they see anything which leads them to question or to ask a reasonable question, then there's a likelihood they'll uphold. And our advice ultimately is, if you're in doubt, don't do it. Can we have the next slide, please, Rob? Just building on the previous slide, it's just the focus here is on personalities. I know there's a significant interest in this. Obviously, under 25s have been banned since the relaxation in the rules under the original framework we created for the Gambling Act in 2007. They've always been prohibited. And particular appeal, the existing appeal rule has caught people like sort of very overtly child-oriented individuals. So if you used a current children's entertainer, that would fall foul of the present rules. The strong appeal concept extends that quite considerably across many more over 25s. And what the ASA is basically looking for you to do as an advertiser, looking at who you're going to feature in your ads, it is basically to understand the roles and activities of personal character. And it's known for, and as we noted in the previous slide, we're looking for this question of what is the role, what is the sort of the sort of level of aspiration, affinity, etc. Can that be said to be something that children are inherently interested in? So the captain of a national sports team, and they might not personally be hugely popular, but someone like that in most sports, national sports, is going to have that sort of sense of aspiration that children want to do that and so forth. And obviously with something like football, that's just pretty much taken as read and goes much deeper into other levels of professional, or the professional pyramid. We're also looking as well, and this is probably, I think, more on a level or on a secondary level, we're also looking at the individual's profile across, what are they known for? We're looking for data on them, to understand what their audience is, for all the things that they do. And I think social media is a very good way into an individual, because obviously that's them as an individual set aside from the roles that they play. But I think we would look, the essay is going to look across the piece, and they're going to be interested in looking at data across all of the roles an individual is known for, and trying to understand if there are any potential sort of red flags there in terms of significant number or proportion of children. So basically, if someone is incredibly popular on social media and has a very small percentage of under 18 following, that number might be quite significant still in absolute terms. Likewise, you might have someone who perhaps isn't hugely popular but has quite a significant child percentage in terms of following. I would obviously the ASA has to decide what the tolerance is, but my view on this, the view of the policy team as we put this together, is basically anything under 5% in terms of the proportion, and that is not an absolute, because obviously other factors are relevant. Anything under 5% is probably not an indicator of a problem unless there are other significant issues. Anything significantly more than that, and I think that we're talking something that the ASA might have concerns about. I appreciate that data isn't perfect, but again, the ASA is looking at indicators, and it's not simply looking at one number. I think the presentation simply of some data from social media on its own as a lone indicator is not going to be sufficient. The diligence needs to be done across a whole range. In fact, on social media, there's an individual, and then there are sort of followings for roles or things that they're associated with. Then the ASA, I think, will expect to see a broad range of that to try to understand as many indicators and metrics of appeal as are possible. If we go to the next slide, please, Rob. The policy, one of the challenges with this policy is obviously that if we have particular appeal, then something like football isn't covered, but strong appeal at the level of an activity would cover football. So if we applied this concept uniformly without any deviation, then all references to football in any guise would simply be banned. We haven't done that because it's not proportionate to the evidence. Our objective is to dial back to basically reduce the level of appeal. We have to balance that with the fact that gambling is a legitimate leisure activity for the purposes of the law, and these products are legally available if they're licensed, in which case there is a scope and there is a space to market them, provided that's done responsibly. So what we've done is include within the policy effectively a set of carve-outs, a set of exemptions, and these are set out in section 15 of the guidance document. They're in quite some detail there. And what we're interested in here is basically when you have an activity which is of itself of inherent strong appeal, so football, then the only things that you can reference are basically the things listed in, or things that come under the characteristics listed in the section 15 set of exemptions A to F, I think they are listed as. Just going through those very briefly. First things first, we are not this is about things which drag in children's appeal. We're not banning simple text or audio references to Ronaldo to score a goal or something along those lines. This is about depictions. We're also drawing the line and giving, I think, a bit of grace here, a bit of an exemption in terms of, particularly for things like sports betting. Again, we'll use football as the example, having generic imagery of actors kicking footballs around or something stylized, having pictures of trophies and crowds screaming and balls flying through the air. I think there are quite a few ads that I've seen over the years that sort of fall under the sort of that type of description. That kind of thing is still acceptable, provided it doesn't go too far into, so for example, using cutesy cartoon characters playing football would obviously be a problem. But the objective is basically to sort of shift the content of gambling advertising more towards the generic and less able to grab the attention of young people. In terms of logos, where they do the same thing as a text reference, so if you had you could say the name of a team, or you could put a team logo in there, or Champions League, you could say the words Champions League or put the Champions League logo in there. There is in section 15, in that part of the guidance, the exemption allows for that kind of reference. Also at the same time, brand logos, obviously some of those have the potential to be of appeal dependent on the content of that logo, colours, imagery, etc. However, obviously they are the identity of the advertiser, and it's, I think, disproportionate to restrict that. In terms of lotteries, lottery products, there's a specific exemption for prizes. Who would not want at any age to win £1 million? And obviously lotteries are distinct in the sense that they enable funding of good causes. We don't want to restrict lottery providers from talking about things like a kids' sports activity scheme that they fund, or activities relating, for instance, to a children's hospice. There is a scope within there for these things to be promoted, provided they conform with the terms of the exemption. And finally, there is an exemption for the use of persons. This particularly relates to football. Again, going back to the sort of the circular logic, if we say that football is of strong appeal, then anyone associated with football would therefore de facto be banned from appearing in gambling ads. And we don't think that's proportionate. What we have done is create a limited exemption. So if you're associated with football, that's not enough to get you restricted from appearing in a gambling ad, provided that you pass the other terms of the guidance in terms of the various aspects in which the ASA will assess an individual's appeal. So basically, any footballer with a significant profile, so top level national players, etc., top European players, global players, etc., these they are very firmly not acceptable. The lower down the pyramid that you go, I think there is more of a likelihood that those individuals might be acceptable, subject to the tests set out in the guidance. I think the same would apply to managers and so forth. In terms of ex-footballers and pundits, etc., this is probably where this exemption is most relevant. Obviously, a footballer who was a bright young thing in 2003, etc., is no longer and has probably finished their career in recent years. There is scope for that kind of individual to appear in ads, but obviously the danger is they're no longer a footballer. There's a risk they might do crazy things like reality TV, or have different interests and profiles born of their involvement in social media and so forth. So basically the risk goes away from them being associated with being a footballer, being a figure of aspiration and so forth, with big audience. It moves on to various different things, fingers in various pies, of which you have to do your diligence to ensure, under the terms of the guidance, that they don't trip the ASA's alarm bells in terms of strong appeal. And I think with that, we're done. So I'll hand back to you, Ron. Thanks.
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Andy. We've had quite a few questions come through. I think some of them you've probably covered off, but if we just start with this first one. So someone's asked that we mentioned football being problematic from October. How about popular women's football players in the WSL? Could they be featured in gambling advertising?
It's an interesting question. We've said top flight in the guidance, we've said top flight players. So I think that there's a significant risk there. Obviously, the women's football is something which has begun to really evolve and grow quite exponentially in recent years. I think, yes, obviously, in terms of the weight of audience, etc., it's not of a comparison to men's football. But for example, the England ladies team, I think, did very well in the I was going to say recent, but it's probably pre-COVID times, wasn't it? The World Cup, and obviously drew very, very considerable audiences. I think that there's quite a lot of risk there. And the problem is not per se, and this is a really good example, the problem is not the audience aspect of that, in terms of the metrics. The problem is that those figures, those women are significant figures of aspiration. Their role, what they do, is something which is going to lock into the experience of young girls who want to play football. And therein lies the very significant potential, certainly for the top players, and possibly even sort of top teams as well, for that to be deemed of strong appeal by the ASA.
Great. Thanks, Andy. Someone else has asked about Ronnie O'Sullivan, the snooker player, in a gambling ad. He is in a sport that's less likely to have strong appeal to children, but may have crossover, especially as he recently won the world title. However, he also may not be on social media.
What we've said in the guidance is that there are sort of adult-oriented sports, of which snooker is one. So things like darts, golf, etc. Yes, some children do play them, and some children are interested in them, but it's nowhere near the level of football, and it's nowhere near the sort of the mid-tier If you look at data on kids' activity, I think football's somewhere over 50%, and things like cricket, rugby, and so forth are in the middle, around 20-something%, and the others, many of the other more adult-oriented sports, much further down in the low single figures. So someone like Ronnie O'Sullivan's a really good example, because he is in a sport where I don't think that there is a significant problem. However, it's certainly not of strong appeal to children. However, the problem is he himself is the sort of the sports superstar. So he's not young anymore. I think he's getting on for his 40s, isn't he? So he's not sort of got that youth appeal as being the next big thing, as it were. But I think you've got to be careful about the things that he does outside snooker. So I don't think his sort of snooker personality, his set of circumstances around his involvement in snooker are particularly a problem. It's where else he appears, including in social media, which you need to do the diligence on to make sure there isn't anything in there which might give cause to the ASA to consider him of strong appeal.
Perfect, great. I think you might have already covered this one, but I'll mention it again. Someone's asked, what exactly is a considerable volume of under 18 followers on social media? Is there a guideline with regards to the percentage of followers?
I think I gave the point, and I think the first thing that I cannot stress enough is if you come up with simply a number, even if it's a very low number, there is a risk that the ASA will uphold. It's not objective in the sense of anything more than 8.2% is a problem, but anything less than that is fine. These are indicators. You need to go through all of the potential, you need to identify the potential indicators, including social media audiences, so for the individual and the roles, the things that they are known for, and basically run the rule over each of those, assemble the data that you can, so that you understand who this person is in terms of the things that they do, and then try to take a view on the extent to which they are likely to be of strong appeal. As I said, I think 5% is a reasonable sort of benchmark. It's not, you might have someone who has a very low social media following, but suddenly comes to attention for something else that they do. In that case, the low social media following, 1%, 2%, is not going to counteract the other thing. So I think there's a real need just to understand that this is about indicators, and the ASA are looking for any red flags. And I think if there are any, then that's a problem. Having a very low proportion of followers is good. That's a positive thing, but it's not everything.
Perfect. I think this next question leads on quite well from that. So someone's mentioned about Michael Owen, who is now a football pundit, who they assume would still be acceptable if they had the data to back it up, that he does not use social media. However, he did recently feature on The Masked Singer on ITV, which a lot of children do watch. So does that mean that he would be unacceptable?
He's an interesting example, which I sort of alluded to, because obviously he was sort of very, very famous around the start of his career as a young superstar after the France World Cup 25 years ago. My view is the Masked Singer Association would be enough for the ASA to uphold. As to that kind of individual, he obviously doesn't have that broader profile. I'm not a massive follower of all things sort of celeb gossip column, but he just appears, he basically appears, from what I understand, to be into racehorses and does a bit of punditry. That kind of profile is probably not terrible in terms of the risks. But this is a good example of someone who really is sort of on probably veering towards the okay side, but does one thing recently that brings them into significant focus. The Masked Singer, I think I've seen a couple of examples of sports people who've done that in terms of questions we've been asked, and I think that's a good case study of something which just immediately drags them back more into the public eye and more into the eyes of under 18s.
Great, thanks, Andy. Someone else has asked, with the new rules, I understand that Premier League players are now unacceptable to be featured. However, how about lower league players from the division below, such as the Championship?
I think, as we've said in the guidance, they are a moderate level of risk. Obviously, there will be players with significant profiles who have from recently relegated clubs, or older players who've moved down a bit, as it were. The risks come with that. You know, in my view, if you are, so for example, if on your own site you are featuring you know, just the headshots of players in games, sort of in sort of League Two or even non-league or whatever, in one of your promotions or something, that kind of thing is more likely. Obviously, they wouldn't be able to be under 25 unless you'd. Actually, no, they would, because we have an exemption to that rule in the CAP code. Sorry about that. That kind of thing, you're on more safe ground. I think the championship's sort of in between and in the middle. It isn't the top level competition, but it still has quite a significant profile. I think you would need to build a pretty strong case that this person is just doesn't have that kind of national profile. Obviously, your local team, they will be the idol of their local fan base. But in terms of a national profile, you'd have to build a good case to ensure that wasn't the. You have to build a good case to ensure that wasn't the case.
Perfect, great. Someone's queried about the difference with the alcohol sector. So that also has a strong appeal rule. Is football unacceptable in that sector as well, so that the two are uniform? I
think the issue here is that basically alcohol products are separate from. They're separate from alcohol products are not in any way connected with things like sport or video games. They are a bottle or a can of something that you buy, whereas these products are inextricably sort of shaped around sport. A sports bet is on the sport, the individual or whatever. So there is more of an immediacy to that. The issue, the decisions that the ASA has made in the past in that area, they are, I think, you know, the ASA will have to consider whether there is something of a read across there.
Great. And someone's asked, what's triggered such rules to come into place, such strict rules to come into place?
The changes came about through our consultation, which was prompted by GambleAware's 2-year study into the impact of gambling ads in the UK. And this was the first really significant tranche of research which actually looked at this country in a much more holistic way than simply saying, you know, kids see this many ads, or here's a small scale study. This was quite a broad piece of research. And ultimately, its conclusions were that gambling ads in the UK, which have always been subject to our rules, that they have more of an impact on under 18s than previously thought. And when we looked at research from abroad, we've always got to balance the fact that those ads, that framework, etc., isn't the same as ours. This was the first time we'd seen someone actually putting together a considerable critique and sort of research-informed comment on our sort of patch on our regulations in practice, and it was felt that basically that justified an extension and expansion of the scope of the types of ad content that are not acceptable.
Great, thanks, Andy. I'm slightly conscious of time, but I'll just do these 2 final questions that have come through. So someone has asked, would these rules obviously apply to age-gated ads, such as Facebook ads?
This is a good point. I didn't cover it in the slides because if you look at the guidance, there are quite a lot of sort of moving parts to this. There is an exemption set out in the latter, right at the end of the guidance, which basically allows for ads which are narrowly targeted. So by narrowly targeted, we mean that you can all but 99% exclude the possibility of an under 18 receiving it. So in a simple sense, if you have a mailing list where you have good levels of understanding of the age of all of the individuals on that list, you could send them a communication which includes content of strong appeal. That would not, for example, allow you to use sort of various inferred data or given ages on social media. That's not acceptable. You would have to have the data to hand to allow you to understand who each individual you're targeting is and have a very good idea of what their ages are. So operators obviously have mailing lists based on their present customers or people who have previously perhaps been customers and still allowed permission to be marketed to. if they've gone through the Gambling Commission, the license mandated age checks, then that type of data is good data and will allow you to target ads in a way which benefits from that exemption set out in the guidance. I think that's not exclusive. I think there are other sources of that, in the sense that you can source data which comes, for instance, through credit checking and that type of thing, which gives you an extremely high level of certainty of who the individual is and how old they are. And there also might be the possibility as well of ads being displayed in sort of walled garden environments, past sign-in walls, where the only person who can sign in is the account holder or the named individual, and that individual has gone through a process which ensures that beyond the wall they are the only people who are likely to be viewing. A very good example of that is your own websites, in the sense of ultimately, if you're doing the sign-in processes that you're required to be doing, you can put promotions on your sites behind the sign-in wall, which you wouldn't be able, or using imagery, etc., which you wouldn't be able to do outside that to anyone, a user coming, an unknown user just coming in off the web. So there is scope for that, and any marketing channel, there are some listed in the guidance, but any marketing channel that conforms to that, there is a case for you to be able to use it. But obviously you have to satisfy the ASA that basically it's not about segmenting your audience, it's about segregating, that you can segregate and cut your audience up. Yes, the ASA will have a very small level of tolerance to aberrations and exemption and exceptions and so forth, but if you can show that a very, 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 very high percentage of the people viewing an ad are guaranteed to be over 17, then that's a media channel that you can use with this kind of content.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. I think that's it for questions for now. I think your answer there covered off the other question that we had as well. So just a reminder, I'm going to share the recording with everyone after the session and a copy of the slides, and I'll also share the guidance as well, so everyone has that too. There's a few slides at the end of the deck here, just with further information about where you can get further guidance and advice from the ASA and CAP. But that's it from us for now. Thanks so much, Andy. I hope everyone found the session informative and enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.